If you are pregnant, listen up because there is an upcoming live pregnancy workshop available to help you prepare your body and pelvic floor for birth and beyond. We discuss ways to reduce risk of perineal tears and episiotomy. We learn how to reduce risk of pelvic floor trauma and, importantly, ways to support a strong postnatal recovery. This free workshop called Birth Strong is physio-created and designed to help you feel more confident and empowered about your upcoming childbirth experience. Head to fitnessmama.com/pregnancy workshop and the link is in the show notes. Once more, that's www.fitnessmama.com/pregnancy workshop, all one word. Can't wait to see you there. If you are pregnant or you've recently had a baby, this podcast is for you. I am your host, Kath Bequee, a physiotherapist working in women's health and mum of 3. Inside my online program, Fitness Mama, I just love helping support women to care for their bodies during pregnancy, prepare their bodies for birth, and support their after-birth recovery, helping them feel confident and strong inside out during this important stage of their lives. In this podcast, join me each week as we dive into all things pregnancy care, childbirth, and postnatal recovery, helping you through every step of the journey. It is absolutely possible to feel amazing and confident in our bodies during this motherhood journey, and I want that for you. Come and say hi to me on Instagram @fitnessmama, and let's dive into today's episode. Hello and welcome back to the Pregnancy, Birth and Recovery podcast. So today I chat with Brianne, who is a beautiful member inside Fitness Mama. She's been a member for a few years actually, and we have spoken previously. She shared her birth story of beautiful Elle, which I'll link in the show notes, and Elle is now 3.5, 4 years old. So she volunteered. I often put it out to my members and ask who would like to share their story on the podcast, and she contacted me and said she'd love to share the story of her second little boy, Seth. Seth's now 8 months, and I have had to, this was an amazing conversation. I've actually split this episode into 2 parts. So this is part 1. And in the lead up to Seth's birth and pregnancy, I just want to let you know that this episode might not be for you because Brianne does discuss postnatal depression of a close family member. There is talk of death. There is discussion around conceiving through this grief process. So there are a lot of tears. It's a really, I'm so thankful for Brianne for sharing her story. She then does discuss her pregnancy, her first pregnancy, which she terminated for medical reasons. Then for part 2, this is her subsequent pregnancy after the termination, and Brianne shares her beautiful story, birth story and recovery journey. So it's like these 2 podcast episodes go through a whole circle in terms of the whole process from conceiving through grief, termination for medical reasons, falling pregnant again, and then giving birth to a healthy, happy baby. So I do just want to let you all know that before we start this conversation, if you want to skip over this part 1, go for it. And if you're after just the positive birth story, then just skip over part 1 and go straight for part 2. The reason I'm sharing part 1 is I'm sure there's people out there who are trying to conceive through grief, and like Brianna's just sharing her story, and I know her story will be different to other people's story. Like everyone's experience is different, even if you might be going through similar situations. But Brianne does an incredible job at sharing her experience, and I thought it would be valuable for those who perhaps are going through the grief process or perhaps They've also had to have termination for medical reasons. There's a lot of value in that, but I also know it's not for everyone. This is part 1. As I mentioned, last warning, if you want to skip over to part 2, go for it. We do discuss in this episode postnatal depression, and I will link some resources in the show notes too. Brianne, welcome back to the Pregnancy, Birth and Recovery podcast. We're going for birth story number 2. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Kat.
Amazing. We were just having a chat off air and I was just asking, how long has it been since we last spoke? And can you give us a quick reminder, how old is Elle now, your first bubs?
Yeah, so she's almost 4. So we would have spoken when she was probably 3 months old.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I'll link the first birth story in the podcast show notes. But today we're going to discuss your little baby boy, Seth. And how old's Seth now?
So he's 8 months now and he is just a joy.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
Off air, you were just telling me all about your crazy busy lifestyle at the moment. Can you give us, the quick 20-second version of how you, what are you doing as a mum of 2? How are you staying busy apart from the obvious?
Look, I think when you have your second, you kind of have a little bit of structure already organised with parenting. So I felt a bit able to jump back into things a bit quicker. But I'm a student midwife. I work part-time at UQ in research on a midwifery project at the moment. And I do a little bit of extra work for Red Nose Australia and for the Australian College of Midwives, just building community for students. So I have a great family support, great husband, and daycare, which makes that possible. Yeah.
Amazing. So as I said, today, although it's very, with a birth story, when I find I'm talking through and asking questions, it's so hard to separate the different births. But today, let's try to focus more on your beautiful baby boy, Seth, because you have got quite a story to tell. So,
it wasn't an easy path for him. So I hope that some of this story helps someone listening to feel less alone on their path.
Yeah. So, Brianne, I'm going to let you take it away and start where you want to start in this journey.
So I guess I can kind of start where we left off, which was, I guess, when we decided we were ready to start trying for a second baby. So we had been extremely fortunate with Elle in that we conceived on our first month that we tried. So we were very conscious that, not expecting that to happen again, but conscious that it could happen again. And that kind of took us by surprise when that happened. So we waited. I always wanted kind of 2 kids, close together in age. I think that this is this kind of ideal that you are kind of sold, I think, societally, and maybe how I was raised as well, with lots of siblings all close in age. So when Elle turned 1, we had her first birthday, and that was the kind of ticking over point where we said, okay, we'll start trying when she turns 1. So I'm quite an organised person. I've always tracked my ovulation and, when your fertile window is and all of that. So we started trying that month, and my period was due in a few days. So I was kind of in that, oh gosh, maybe I could be pregnant, that lovely little feeling. And we had a bit of a shock about 2 days before my period was due. I had been supporting my sister-in-law, so it's my husband's sister. We were extremely close. She was, my best friends for 10 years since we'd met. So we called each other sisters. We never really referred to each other as sisters-in-law. So it's very awkward for me to say she's my sister-in-law. I always just, from now on, for this podcast, we'll just say sister, because that's how we talked about each other. But she had just given birth to her second baby, little baby boy, and she was struggling with postnatal depression and anxiety. He was 3 months old, and we just had a really shocking day where we lost her to suicide, which was the biggest shock of my life. I'd never experienced something so traumatic.
I'm so sorry, Brianne.
It's a tricky one to talk about, but I don't think you're ever prepared. And certainly in sharing about her death, my main kind of message is that it was very sudden. I think the perception that I had of a death in that way beforehand, I think I always thought, oh, someone's ill for a long time. Maybe they've been contemplating this for a long time. I just had that perception.
Like, I feel like I don't, it's almost like I don't know what to say, Brianne. Like, you mentioned this just off air before we hit record. And I said to you, like, wow, it's a really important conversation. And as you mentioned, this is going to be entwined in a conversation about your, like, conceiving self.
Yeah.
But for everyone listening, like, I almost feel, I'm putting myself out there. Like, I'm physio. I'm not a grief counselor. Like, this sort of news, it sends chills down my spine and makes me want to burst into tears. And and I can't imagine what you and your whole family have been through, and the children and the husband, and it, as I said off air, like, it's like opening up a can of worms, and I don't know how much to ask. Like, I don't necessarily want to dig into something you don't feel ready to share. I guess a question I do have on my mind, and feel you don't have to answer, like, this isn't what this podcast episode is necessarily about, but when you have this life-changing news, it's a really close family member, there's children involved, like, how have you moved on, like, progressed from there? How have you moved forwards?
Oh, gosh, a lot of therapy. A lot of therapy. It was hard for a long time. It was really hard. Yeah, I mean, I had to seek out a psychologist that specialised in grief. That was the best thing I could have done. And I said this to family members on my side that tried to reach out and support me, that all you can really, like I said to people later on, I was like, all you can really do is encourage them to get professional help as soon as possible. I went through a few different providers. I thought, oh, my workplace provides a counsellor, I'll try that. That's free. A few different avenues that just weren't really providing the level of care that I needed. And it wasn't until I sought out my own, like, psychologist that was trained in grief, and I went and had that first appointment with them, and I said, oh, wow, this is transformative for me in terms of my ability to accept what's happened. And it's a form of death that does create a lot of anger within you as well. So you have to work through that anger. But ultimately, time really is one of the only things I think that really makes a difference. And as we talk about my kind of process of conceiving Seth, in some ways I look back on this type of death, when you do lose someone unexpectedly, there is the silver lining that every day you go forward is adding more time between the event, the traumatic event, and where you are now. And every day that does help. There's also, I found a fantastic book. I think it was by Megan Devine. And it's just, the title, I think, is just that it's okay that you're not okay. And I found that book to be extremely helpful because it really went through, like, our cultural kind of perception of death and grief. A lot of your support people are very well-meaning, where we live in a society where we want to be productive, we want to help someone that's suffering. But a lot of the time, things that someone might say to you, I think people find it hard to sit in grief.
Yeah.
They want to help you to feel better.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if someone says, I can't even think of an example, but by them trying to be productive to help you to feel better makes it hard for you because you just want to be in your grief. You're not ready to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I learned a lot about, I guess, our culture and how we a lot of the time shy away from the painful because it's not fun, for anyone really to sit in grief. But ultimately that's kind of what I had to do. And, I took time off work. I ended up resigning from my job these things do transform your life in many ways. It transforms your relationships with friends, with family. Some people are capable of being there with you through it, and others just simply aren't. And that's okay. And you have to grieve those changes in your life as well. But you get to a point where that feels okay.
Yeah.
And you kind of do eventually get to a place where you can see more what you've learned from it than how painful it is. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
All right.
We need to pause.
Yeah. So
get tears dried. Okay. So let's go back to when you heard the news and you were trying to conceive at that stage for number 2.
Yeah. So like the reason it's so that kind of connection between her death and when I started to conceive is because my cousin or something, my cousin contacted my GP immediately. All of my supports came in to help me to get me a GP appointment the next day. To just start the process of getting support in place for me. And I hadn't been sleeping, obviously. So I asked for some sleeping medication. And she said, could you be pregnant? Before I prescribe you this, could you be pregnant? And that's why I still have that memory of doing a pregnancy test in her office, hoping and praying that I wasn't pregnant, because you're in a state of shock and you just couldn't take that on right now at all. So that's why that kind of connection is there for me still, in that this was the start of that process of trying to conceive. As you can expect, we weren't really trying for a few months. We were just in our grief. But at the same time, your child is growing. Elle's getting older every month. And that dream that you had of 2 small children close in age, it's still there within you. And so there's still a want for the baby, to become pregnant. And in some ways that want gets even stronger because you are living so much in your mind in the past, analysing and thinking and, debating and feeling anger or, trying to process your grief. And the thought of having a pregnancy and a baby to look to the future about, almost that need becomes bigger. So it's a very kind of complicated place where you're grieving, but you're almost become desperate for a life, for new life, and like almost like if I conceive, then I'm back onto my path that I had wanted before my life got thrown upside down. So there was quite a few months of kind of that feeling, trying to conceive. You would have triggers all the time, and then you would be frustrated with your triggers because I might know that I'm around ovulation, but then I have had this trigger, and so I'm extremely sad for 2 days or something. And then you're all this complicated because you're like, I know that this stress of this grief is probably preventing me from falling pregnant. So you're kind of in this really complicated relationship with your body and with your grief. I went and saw an acupuncturist and she said, they ask you these questions. Do you have any stresses in your life? I was like, well, I've actually shaped my life very carefully to, I work part-time or I'm on maternity leave. I take a lot of time for my own health and wellness. My husband and I, focus on our health. We work part-time. We try to have a good, life balance and everything. So from that perspective, no, but have a lot of grief. And grief is a form of stress. And so there was just that constant kind of frustration, I guess, of the level of grief I was having to be in while trying to conceive. And this is definitely not like a unique situation. Trying to conceive through grief is, it happens to a lot of people. And in particularly if you're struggling with infertility, there is a lot of grief in that process. And so these sorts of feelings are not that uncommon, but I'm not sure that we really talk about those challenges very much. So we did that for a while, and then I did fall pregnant after about 6 months. And I was just elated. I was just so happy. I was extremely anxious about miscarriage, I think, as you can imagine. I just thought you're not ready.
Yeah.
for that to happen. And I knew I had not had a miscarriage before. So I was a bit nervous that this could be my time. But all in all, things were going well.
So
I was extremely morning sick, but
how long from start of trying to conceive did you conceive?
I think it was 6 months.
Yeah.
About 6 months.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine, there was a few months in there where that wasn't, so relatively didn't take that long in the scheme of trying to conceive.
Yeah.
So I was extremely morning sick, which that's just my joy of early pregnancy. But everything was going well. I was checking in terms of like level of anxiety about miscarriage. I was checking every single day, watching like if you're 6 weeks and 4 days, what's your chances? If you're 6 weeks and 5 days, what's your chance? I was obsessively watching that marker become more and more optimistic. But I get quite ill, so, the immediate people in your life kind of know. And then, unfortunately, I chose to do the NIPT, which we've done every pregnancy, and just got a phone call from my GP's office. Wasn't my GP, but it was the receptionist calling to tell me, your GP wants an urgent appointment with you tomorrow to discuss your NIPT results. And you just know, that's not a good sign, because I think you're thinking back to my last pregnancy. I'm pretty sure, my GP just called me and said, yeah, it's all fine, no worries, and hung up the phone. So automatically, and I think this is not particularly an uncommon experience for people that you get told you need an appointment to talk about results, but you have to wait however long to get in for that appointment. And for me, that was the next day. It was like a 2 p.m. appointment or something. I've heard far worse waiting periods. My next appointment I could get was 5 days later. I mean, the thought of that to me is just like a form of torture. So even for me, it was the next day at 2 p.m. and I'm calling the GP, for the rest of the day, I'm calling the office being like, is there a cancellation? Is there an earlier appointment? I don't want to wait till 2 p.m. to find out. Can you just send me the document? I understand the medical side of it. I can just read it myself. Just give me the information. And my GP ended up calling back at 7:30 a.m. the next day, just saying, if you can get to my office before my first appointment, I'll see you before they go in, which in hindsight, I really think we should be giving this information over telehealth. If a woman is at home supported by her family to hear that information, then we should be giving it to her in the place where she can be supported. In hindsight, I got in the car straight away. I drove across Brisbane. I sat there on my own because my husband was suddenly looking after our toddler, to take everyone with me in peak hour or whatever. So I'm then sitting in an office on my own to hear this news and driving home crying in the car in peak hour traffic to get home to relay that information to my family. So I think, going forward, we should be really using telehealth more. I think there's nothing wrong with telehealth if people are in the place that they feel most supported.
Yeah.
So we got that notice at the GP that our son, well, we hadn't known it was a son, but that our son had 47XXY. Well, sorry, not that he didn't have it, but he was screened as high risk for 47XXY syndrome, which is known as Klinefelter syndrome, which I'd never heard of before.
No, neither.
And I'm sharing this, what he had, because I also went online to try to find other women's stories of having this syndrome. I couldn't find anything. And there are certain things picked up on NIPT, certain conditions that are spoken about a lot. And others, like Klinefelter syndrome, are kind of known as grey diagnoses, where they're not particularly life-limiting. So, certain syndromes, you might know with Edwards or Patel syndrome, the chances of your baby passing in pregnancy or shortly after being born is very high. So in those situations, it's not a matter of will your baby be living or not. It's more when your baby will pass at some point in this period it's when will that pass? Do you plan to continue the pregnancy, or would you like to make a choice to end the pregnancy now, knowing that they have a fatal diagnosis? So that's kind of one end of, I guess, the syndromes that can be picked up on NIPT. And then the other end is these ones where NIPT has been screening for them only more recently, has it had the capability to pick up these syndromes. And so there's a little bit less information out there about what that is, what that means for your child. And they're kind of known as the grey diagnosis. So you're not choosing when your child will die, but you're choosing if they are going to die, like now, or if they will live a life and what that life might look like. So that was the high risk screen that we got.
And can I ask a little bit more, because I don't know about this syndrome, what sort of symptoms could they have?
Yeah, look, honestly, it's been a couple of years since, if you can imagine, we sat down for 24 hours and scoured the internet. And I've just quickly kind of refreshed because it's been a couple of years. But ultimately, the underlying issue is that they are born male, but it's an endocrine deficiency, so their body's not able to produce testosterone. And so it's really then looking at, well, what organ systems are in their body? Do males need testosterone for those parts of their body to function normally? So things like osteoporosis has a higher incidence. They have weak bones, weak and brittle bones, or can have, I don't want to say anything is definite. There's a range of possibility. As babies, you might see weak muscles, taking longer to sit, crawl, walk. When they become into schooling, you might see learning deficiencies, various things.
Okay. That's a whole range.
Because they don't. Yeah, there's a whole range, and also you don't know, will it be severe, will it be mild? You're unsure of what it would look like for your child. Yeah. The one thing that's kind of is well known is that if they're not producing testosterone, then they're not likely to produce any sperm. Yeah. So they are very likely to be infertile. Yeah. There are cases of extracting a little bit of sperm at a young age or something. Yeah. But in the past, it's not something that could be screened antenatally. And so it's not uncommon for men to find out they have Klinefelter syndrome when they go to have children. Yeah, right. And realise they're infertile, and then be kind of given this information about their body, and that potentially explains some of their experiences in their younger life. There is testosterone therapy that you can do, but then there's also side effects of those things. So, for me, the decision to go ahead or not go ahead was very tricky, to be honest. I think it is important that every couple has a conversation before they do NIPT, just around what they think they might do, because it's hard, when you are faced with that information. But ultimately, my husband and I both said we're kind of on the fence, not really sure which way we should go. And when it is a grey diagnosis, I think I've read some research about it, that the husbands, especially this was the case in my experience, tend to go very quiet and not want to give you their opinion of what they want to do, because they're very concerned about swaying you toward a decision that you might later resent them for if it wasn't your innate choice. So it's a particularly lonely period for women if you have a partner who, my husband loves me so much, he didn't possibly want to influence my decision. So you're trying to gauge what do you want to do, but they don't want to say because they don't want to. Yeah. So it's a very tricky kind of space. Ultimately, we kind of had this cryptic conversation. Maybe I'm leaning this way. Would you be happy or unhappy if I leant that way? And trying to gauge a decision together. Which thankfully, I think we both came to the same conclusion, because ultimately, I don't know how you move forward if you have opposing choices there. And I know divorce rates are, higher after terminations for medical reasons. So you can see like the relational issues that can come about just purely from the experience.
Yeah.
So our option, I guess, NIPT is only a screening test. So our option was to do a chorionic villi sampling, which is a CVS procedure. So I got a referral to our public hospital to kind of go down that path. So I can explain what a CVS is if you want.
Yeah, well, let's go for it. Yep.
I went, and this is the point I will say, my doctor kind of said, oh, you'll probably get faster treatment if you go privately. And I just wanted to make sure that was worthwhile. So I called my local public hospital, and I'm very fortunate to live in a metro area. And they basically said, as soon as we get your referral, we will be on the phone with you straight away. We will be organising the procedures, whatever you need. It will happen quickly because if you are deciding to end a pregnancy, at this point I was 13 weeks pregnant. If you're deciding to end a pregnancy, your options change drastically between 13 weeks and 20 weeks. So you do need to move quite quickly if you want to have all of the options available to you.
Before we move on, since you've just been discussing the pregnancy, like since then we haven't, you have just been within the last year through the death of your sister, like an emotional, turbulent time. How are you feeling when you got this diagnosis? Like that's a real kick in the guts.
Yeah, it really was. I remember saying to my mum after my sister died, I hope this is the worst thing that ever happens in my life. I really, truly hope, because if something worse was to happen, it means something's happened to my husband or to my children. And so then when this happened, it was horrible. It was truly horrible. Yeah. And so now I talk about my sister's death and I think I'm not sure if that was the worst day of my life or not.
Yeah.
Because for me, the day I got the call after the CVS from the hospital, I was at home with my husband and they gave me the news over the phone, which I really appreciated. I'll never forget.
Sorry.
Sorry. That was really hard. And to be honest, everyone has a different experience in this. I call it it was like a limbo week. You get this news that, maybe the NIPT is like 88% accurate for this condition. So, there's a 12% chance everything's fine. And then you're still pregnant and your baby's still,
growing,
alive and well inside you. And I call it like my limbo week, where I was already going into this, I was so morning sick. And then you add on this stress. And I know my mum, she came to my house. She lives an hour away and she stayed with me that week. And she had lost a baby when she was younger. And I can't say how much of a blessing that was to have someone so close to me by my side through this. But I remember her saying to me, you are so ill. You are just really sick, aren't you? I was like, I'm already so morning sick. And now on top of this, I'm when you're going through something and your guts are just churning and it's just horrible. So that actual week of waiting, I needed it to be over as quick as it could be. And not everyone has that experience. Some people really want to be with their baby for as long as they can be and really enjoy those days, do things, make memories, go on a hike, get photos, whatever it might be. They want to kind of embrace those days. The thought of that was so far from where I was. And for me, it was I needed to put time between this happening and where I was. But when you're still pregnant, you can't start that process. And obviously a silver lining is that I've already got my fantastic grief psychologist in my corner. So compared to some women who may not have that support already in place, I was in some ways fortunate to have that already. Yeah.
And so I might have missed it, but when they gave you the results on the phone at the CSV, what did they tell you?
So they had, for example, I think they got my referral on the Tuesday. I went in on the Wednesday. I had the procedure on the Wednesday. I got the phone call. They tried to call me on the Friday. I think, this all moved very quickly compared to a lot of people that I've spoken to with similar experiences. They just called. They said, are you at home? Do you have support people with you right now? And just said, look, the tests have come back positive for the condition. And have you, I guess, come to a decision about what you want to do? Because there's only really a rush to do this testing if you are thinking about terminating the pregnancy. Because there are risks involved with doing a CVS in terms of, it's quite a low risk, but the miscarriage is a risk of putting a needle in and taking out some placental cells, So you're only going to be doing those procedures if there is a chance you would probably terminate. If you're happy to proceed regardless, you wouldn't probably do the CVS and take those risks. You could just test and confirm after baby's born. So they just confirmed, what do you want to do from here? And I just explained to them, we've made the decision to terminate. Sorry.
No, you're okay. Do you want to grab water or?
Yeah, I got myself a lovely drink. And I just said, yes, we're going to proceed. And, how soon can that be, please? Because you're really at their mercy, of the hospital structure and the timings and everything. And I think Monday was my birthday.
Oh, God.
And I just said, just not Monday, please. So I think it was booked in for Tuesday. So in the scheme of things, all very quickly, and you just go into survival mode, I guess, until then. In some ways I was lucky because I had my daughter. She was 1.5, nearly 2. They pull you out, children pull you out of your grief, force you to be present. And she knew, she was old enough to see that mummy's in pain and mummy's struggling. And I wasn't trying to hide my grief from her. I think that's one thing that I learned through it all, is that it's actually really important to model healthy ways of coping with grief to your children.
Yeah.
So I would try to be really explicit with her, mummy's feeling sad, mummy's thinking about auntie. I'm just going to sit in the garden to, just sit with the plants or something, or I'm just going outside to talk to my mum, to talk about my feelings, or, So I try to always be very explicit with her, this is how I'm feeling and this is what I'm going to do to try to feel better. And I think that's important because, there was literally no way for me to hide all of this from my child. Yeah. So that was kind of the approach that I took was, it's okay to cry in front of her. It's just, I'm going to show her what we can do to feel better. My husband worked from home during all this time. And I guess that's another aspect I think worth sharing, is that everyone's experience of these sorts of deaths is different. I was extremely struggling. But for my husband, I had really wanted a second child, and he was not that fussed about having more kids. He loves our daughter, loves being a dad, pretty happy. He would have been happy to stop at one. And obviously when you're pregnant, you'll experience all the physical effects of the pregnancy, so it feels a lot more real. I think can feel a lot more real to the woman. Yeah. So for my husband, he just wasn't really that bad. He wasn't, people say but everyone grieves differently, just because he wasn't showing it. I said, yeah, that's true. But we did sit down and have a very deep conversation about what exactly are you feeling? Because I was struggling. I'm going, you don't seem sad at all when I'm here, just really struggling. And he just explained, he just was kind of fine with it, not bothered by it, worried mostly for me and supporting me than having to deal with any kind of his own grief.
Yeah.
And that was hard in itself to have a partner that wasn't grieving the death of a child that you were grieving so hardly.
I guess
hard.
I guess I can understand that a little bit. Like, you're sleep deprived because you've been feeling so unwell. Your hormones are all over the shop. Like, it's like a different playing field. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't be angry at him for not being sad. I said, like, all I can ask of you is to be open and honest with me about how you're feeling. And so I have to accept, like, that you're not upset and come to terms with that and accept that. And, over time, see the silver lining in that you could be my rock and you could step up and do, everything for our daughter for those days when I couldn't get out of bed or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But when I hear of stories of husbands crying over these situations, there's a little bit of me that still, like, yearns for that kind of camaraderie through grief. And I did say to my husband, like, in some ways, when my sister died, we all grieved together. Whereas in this experience, you're grieving a lot of the time very alone. So it's just a different type of grief, a different type of trauma. And obviously over time, then you can get this, like, complex trauma because things are all become interrelated and hard to separate them. So your grief kind of, grows. Luckily, it was close to Christmas and I had 4 weeks of annual leave and, I didn't go back to work 4 weeks.
Brianne, do you mind if I ask, and you don't have to share what you feel comfortable with, but I haven't had a conversation, well, I guess I probably should have, but an in-depth conversation with someone who's had an abortion. Do you mind talking us through a little bit the process and, like, how you went on that day?
Yeah. And if you are okay for me to say in this forum, like, for me, just the language around it is really important to me. And I've given this feedback to some midwifery clinics and things, is that, and I think this is common in the termination space, is that, like, I like the term termination for medical reasons. So I identify with that.
Yes,
if I'm putting it in writing, I'll put, like, TFMR as like the explanation of what occurred.
Thank you for pulling me up on that.
But in my mind, like, I like to separate, like, abortion is like a social, for social reasons or other reasons.
Yeah.
And so I align with using the term termination, but everyone's different.
Yeah.
I've known people who have used the word stillbirth for theirs because they feel more comfortable. I think societally there's a lot more comfort talking about that your baby was stillborn than that you had termination. So in terms of the process for me, so I was 13 weeks at the time. So up to, in the public system, this is my understanding, it could be different. You have around about up to 16 weeks. If you're beyond 16 weeks, your options is to labour and deliver. That's why there's a bit of speed there if you want all the options. So my options at the time were, I could have a medical termination. So that would be similar to maybe what you might do at an earlier stage of pregnancy as well, take some medication, miscarry at home, I guess. That's my understanding of that. I've not been through that process, but I chose to have a surgical termination. So that involved, having your appointment with an obstetrician to sign all the paperwork, because there's a lot of kind of strict legalities around it. And then presenting at the hospital in the morning, being prescribed misoprostol, which is a dilating medication, like a prostaglandin. That's right. So that moment, I think, for me was really tough, sitting in that room. My husband was allowed to be with me up until I was wheeled into the surgery, which I've heard different stories, but in some private practices, that's not the case. So I'm very grateful my husband was there by my side, because as soon as you take that, you have these 2 tablets in your hand and like I put those in my mouth and this is it. So while you've signed all the forms, it becomes very real in that moment. So you take the tablets and then you wait a couple of hours and then you'll be taken through the surgery. So the idea being that your cervix will soften and open a little bit so then they can do the surgery to remove your baby. I wasn't at the gestation where I needed for the baby's heart to be stopped before the procedure. So if you are further along, I think it's about 20 weeks, they will stop the baby's heart beforehand as well. But I was at such an early gestation. Well, I shouldn't say early. I was at 13 weeks. So they knew that if the baby was removed, they wouldn't be alive or able to stay alive. For me, that was kind of tough because if we think back to my birth story with Elle, I had a precipitous labour with her. So she was born very quickly. So they gave me that medication, and 2 hours for my body was actually a long time. And if you think that my baby's not a full-term baby, so I was having quite strong contractions, pains, labour pains. And there was a whole heap of midwives with me in that room then because they were concerned that within that 2 hours I may miscarry in the room, which wasn't the plan. So they were concerned that, my cervixes may open faster. And, so there was that concern, which I guess I said to them at the time, give me all the drugs. I, didn't use drugs in like my full-term labours, but also my baby was not going to be alive. So I don't care what you give me right now. I just want you to take this pain away. So they did, and that was very effective. And then I went in for surgery. So luckily I didn't miscarry in that room because that would have been an extra kind of thing I wasn't prepared for. And one of the reasons for me that I chose surgical termination was I was quite worried about retained product, like retained placenta, because while you're still pregnant and you're going through all this, you're still yearning for a baby. And so I knew already, like, I'm going to want to start trying again straight away. So I guess for me, instead of miscarrying at home and worrying, like, is there anything retained? Has it all passed? I was like, just go in, do the surgery, make sure I can start trying to conceive again as quickly as I can, really. There's a bit of follow-up care. It was it's day surgery. I went home in the afternoon, and what was quite fascinating to me was, I was in recovery, just like, whoa, all of my morning sickness is gone instantly gone. And that was quite a fascinating experience because, when I'd had morning sickness in my other pregnancies, it kind of fades away over, you're like, oh, did it stop at 14 weeks? Did it stop at 20 weeks? I'm not really sure where it stopped, but somewhere in that period I started to feel better. And so going from like a height of sickness to just nothing at all was really quite an experience. And it wasn't until I had that experience that I was like, oh, I was really sick. Because when you go from all of it to nothing, it really gave me that perspective. And then you have options for autopsy and things.
Okay. And Brianne, I almost feel a bit out of line asking this question, so feel free to, again, just say no, Catherine, not appropriate. But did you get to see your baby? Did they offer? Like, what happened once the surgery happened?
So that's something you do have to consider in terms of what process you want to do. So with surgical termination, I was not going to see anything. I had options around the cremation and the funeral. So, but again, not everyone that has this experience through different providers are given all these options. I was fortunate that the hospital I went through was very clear. Do you want your baby to be cremated individually, and then for you to receive and kind of organise it privately yourself, or the hospital I went through does. If you don't want that, they can organise for all of the babies that have been lost in this period. They organise a funeral service and like a group burial, I guess. And you can put a plaque up on the wall there. So there's different options you could take, but not with a surgical termination. There's no time with your child, no. So with a medical, like if I had chosen to do it medically, I would have had that opportunity. And then I waited to a later gestation and I decided to labour until bigger, then I would have had that opportunity. But for me, the priority was just to end things as quickly as possible. and start getting some time between that.
Yeah.
And we chose to do the facilitated group burial, which was a beautiful service and really, really lovely thing that they arranged for families. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't heard of that before. That's a lovely option.
So at our hospital, there's a garden space near the hospital that they just say you wouldn't know it's there unless you know that it's there. And we could put a plaque up for our son, which we chose not to do because I was waiting to make a decision on his name.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people that lose a child and you have a name picked out, but then you kind of reserve that name because you kind of still want.
Yeah.
For me, I was waiting, we were still planning to try again. So if I did have a son, he would be named Seth, but I always knew that baby was also Seth.
Yeah.
So I now refer, I can explain that later when we talk about Seth's birth, but
Okay. Wow. I think because we're going to make this into 2 episodes. So this first one is all about conceiving through grief, termination for medical reasons. But to finish, round out this part of your story before we start with, I guess, the birth story of Seth.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to impart to anyone who perhaps is conceiving through grief or is considering termination for medical reasons, or is there anything just to round out this conversation before we get started with the next?
So I would, mention the support services if you are experiencing a termination for medical reasons. Through Red Nose Australia, they have in-person support groups, online, counselling and whatnot. And also through Pink Elephants, I found Pink Elephants to be quite helpful because they have a private Facebook group for termination for medical reasons. And I think for a lot of women going through that experience, it is different to a miscarriage in some ways. And I found it hard to relate to stories of miscarriage because in many ways I wished I had miscarried. So to find other women who've had to go through that process, I think was extremely important. Conceiving through grief, honestly, one of the only things that probably truly helped me was exercise. Getting those hormonal benefits of exercise was so important to keep me balanced, seeking support if it's becoming too much, which is ultimately what we did. We went to IVF because it was mentally becoming too much for me. So reaching out to additional support.
And with the exercise, you joined a program, Fitness Mama, after the birth of your first bubs, and there have been a few requests for exercises post, I guess, miscarriage and, like in your case, termination after medical reasons. Yeah. Is that something I am considering adding a little module to the app? Is that something you would have found helpful in that period?
I think so because it's validating to find things that are specific to that experience, and you don't find that. I never came across anything that was exercise post. Okay. But maybe I'll do a look. Yeah. I'm not sure. But anything that validates, what your body might be going through is useful, I think, for women.
I think and I probably shouldn't be mentioning on this podcast, but I think one thing that stopped me from recording those workouts is that I'm worried I'm going to use the wrong terminology, or do you know what I mean? You second guess yourself and worried that you're going to say something wrong. But I think I just have to get over that hurdle. At the start of the workout, and I can say, look, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability. This is perfect if you're, in that 3-month period after this, stage. But and
look, owning up to that is really important. And I think there are lots of different aspects in healthcare where we are silent because we're afraid of doing something wrong. And ultimately that silence only perpetuates more silence, which is really hard.
No, you're right.
The minorities.
I have been guilty of that.
The most important thing is to acknowledge your position. No one's going to be angry at you for trying. And getting consumer feedback, right?
Yeah.
In the work that I do at UQ, get someone to watch it that's had that lived experience. And I had that same experience. I had a photographer do my maternity photos for Seth's pregnancy. And I said, I'm really keen for people I'm guilty of this. I love Instagram and I love these family photographers, but when you're trying to conceive and you're struggling, you see these beautiful photos of beautiful families, pregnant bellies. That can be really hard. And I said to her, I really want that's the blurb that goes with my photos on your story to mention the path that we've had.
Yeah.
So she drafted something and sent it to me, and absolutely I read it and I was like, oh, there's some like glaring things that felt really uncomfortable because she hadn't had that experience.
Yeah.
The way she spoke about terminations was different. And I fixed it. I based on my experience, I took out some things that I felt didn't align and helped her to share it in a way that felt respectful. So all you can do is get people.
I'll be sure to send you the show notes and all the website details for you to have a look over, Brianne, before I publish this episode. Brianne, let's go into part 2. Thank you so much for recording this part of the podcast with me. It has been emotional recording it. I don't know if everyone listening, there was just silent tears down my face the whole time. Like I can only guess how you're inspirational in terms of how you've come through the other side of a huge few years. It's a difficult story to tell, like stories to tell. There's a few stories in there. Yeah. And I appreciate you being so open and honest and sharing your stories with us today. So thank you.
And I guess I would just like to say that these were my experiences and they might not feel right to someone who has had a similar lived experience. Kind of the experience that I had and how I processed and think about those things now. But hopefully this part 2, is a lot of the reason that I feel comfortable to speak now. When I was in the depths of my grief, I wasn't ready. But I'm very fortunate to have my little baby boy here now. That has been very healing.
Amazing. Okay.
Family.
Let's have a pause. Let's have a break. And we'll see you for part 2. Thanks for listening to the Fitness Mama podcast, brought to you by the Fitness Mama freebies found at www.fitnessmama.com/free. So please take a few seconds to leave a review, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to take a screenshot of this podcast, upload it to your social media, and tag me at Fitness Mama so I can give you a shout out too. Until next time, remember, an active pregnancy, confident childbirth, and strong postnatal recovery is something that you deserve. Remember our disclaimer, materials and contents in this podcast are intended as general information only and shouldn't substitute any medical advice, diagnosis or treatment. I'll see you soon.